You know how many people grab the cheapest integrated amp they can find, only to end up with a box that can't drive their bookshelf speakers without distortion, and then wonder why the budget option feels like a waste of money? I've spent the last few weeks testing a handful of entry-level stereo amps, reading forums, and watching how people set up their listening rooms, because the fear of buying the wrong thing is real, especially when you've finally saved up for a decent pair of speakers. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon, and it's the kind of detail that matters when you're weighing a $699 Marantz against a $300 competitor that promises good sound but leaves you with a thin, lifeless soundstage. From the moment I unboxed the Marantz Model 40n, the first thing that struck me was how little you actually have to do to get music playing. The back panel has a straightforward layout, 2 speaker terminals, a handful of RCA inputs, and a set of dedicated streaming buttons that light up when you pair your phone. There's no need to hunt for a separate network module or fiddle with a separate DAC. Everything is built right into the chassis. That simplicity is the biggest win for people who want to just add speakers experience without becoming Wi-Fi experts. If you've ever tried to get a cheap amp to work with Spotify through a Bluetooth dongle, you know the frustration of dropped connections and latency. The 40n handles Wi-Fi, AirPlay, Bluetooth, and even the major streaming services natively, so the moment you power it on and connect it to your home network, you're essentially at the ready-to-play stage. Now, let's talk about the real-world use case. I set the 40n up in a modest 12 by 14 foot living room, paired it with a pair of Klipsch RP600M bookshelf speakers, and let the system run for a week of daily listening, morning coffee playlists, afternoon podcasts, evening movie soundtracks. The first thing I noticed was the volume curve. With 70 watts per channel, the amp pushes the speakers comfortably into the 80 dB range without any audible clipping, which is exactly where most people sit when they're not trying to blow the room out. When I cranked the volume for a classic rock track with heavy drums, the bass remained tight and the mids never got mushy, a common complaint with low-power amps that try to overextend. That power level also means you won't need to constantly turn the volume knob up to hear the detail in a quiet acoustic piece, something that's a hidden trade-off on cheaper models that claim high wattage on paper but deliver it with a lot of distortion. The streaming side of the 40n is where the product really tries to justify its price. It supports Spotify Connect, Apple Music, Tidal, and even the newer high-resolution streaming from Qobuz. When I linked my iPhone via AirPlay, the handoff was seamless. I could start a playlist on the phone and finish it on the tablet without dropping the connection. The Bluetooth implementation supports AAC and aptX, which is a nice touch for Android users who want a little extra fidelity over standard SBC. The voice control integration works out of the box with Amazon Alexa, Google Assistant, and Apple Siri. In practice, that means you can tell your smart speaker to play jazz on Tidal and the amp will start streaming without you needing to open an app, something that would otherwise require a separate streaming dongle or a smart speaker with lineout. If you're already in the smart home ecosystem, this is a genuine convenience rather than a gimmick. On the downside, the 40n is an integrated stereo amp, not a full-blown AV receiver. That means it lacks HDMI inputs, Dolby Atmos processing, and the ability to drive a surround sound speaker layout. If your goal is a home theater setup with a projector and a few front left/right speakers, you'll need to look elsewhere. Also, while the sound is described by Marantz as the most musical, the tuning leans slightly toward a warm, mid-centric profile. For listeners who prefer a very analytical, flat response like those who use the system for critical mixing or audiophile reference, the 40n might feel a tad colored. I found that a simple firmware update from Marantz added a pure mode that flattens the curve a bit, but the overall character remains, which is fine for most music lovers but worth noting if you have a very exacting ear. Another practical consideration is the speaker compatibility. The 40n's 70 watts per channel are plenty for efficient speakers, but if you own high impedance, low sensitivity drivers, for example, vintage electrostatic panels or some high-end floor standers rated at 8 ohms and 92 dB sensitivity, you might notice the amp struggling to reach the same volume levels without pushing the gain knob near the top. In my test, the Klipsch pair rated around 95 dB sensitivity reached a comfortable listening level with the volume at about 55%, but a less efficient pair would likely need the gain cranked higher, which can introduce a slight hiss. So the value proposition is strongest when you pair it with speakers that match its power output. Who should buy the Marantz 40n? If